I'm Alan Wardis, and you're listening to Think Radio.
I'm going to introduce a term, long-form concentration. That's one of the primary, should be, one of the primary goals of all formative education, all the way up through the senior year of college.
That's Dr. David Rothman, director of the Western State Colorado University Graduate Program in Creative Writing. We talked about story and poetry and the fundamental role language plays in human life. Join us for this episode of Think Radio.
Think Radio is supported by the Gunnison Country Times, Gunnison's locally owned hometown newspaper, and by the Western State Colorado University Office of Academic Affairs. Think Radio is also supported by listeners like you. To find out how you can become a Think Radio patron, visit alanwardesmedia.com. That's ALANWARTES media.com.
David, I'm really happy you're here. Thanks for joining me.
Alan, it's always a pleasure. I'm delighted you're doing this. It's great to be here.
So you are in the business of training writers because you're the director of the MFA program for creative writing here at Western.
Actually, we call it a graduate program because we also have an MA and a certificate in publishing. So
I stand
we call
corrected.
it the graduate program in creative writing because we don't want the other degrees and certificates to be invisible.
I get it. Okay. The point is, you're all about training people to be good at putting words into the world. And I really want to talk about that today because there's so much need for good words in the world. And we're going to get there. But first, I want to talk a little bit about yourself because in addition to being the director of the graduate program here, you're also the poet laureate of the Western Slope of Colorado. And you're the resident poet of Colorado Public Radio. You wear a lot of hats. You do a lot of things. You mentor a lot of writers, for that matter, even in an unofficial capacity. So I'm curious to know how somebody gets to be David Rothman. And so I want to start with this question right here. What were you reading when you were 10 years old?
When I was 10 years old, it was a dark and stormy night.
Well, Snoopy wrote that.
Yeah, I'm not sure too many people would want to be David Rothman. But when I was 10 years old, I don't know. I've always been completely omnivorous. I know I was very enamored of Tolkien at that age, and I was reading a lot of science fiction. I expect I was reading Isaac Asimov's Foundation trilogy as well. But I also was reading poetry already at that age and loved it. And it's all sort of a continuum for me. So I don't remember which books I was necessarily reading then because I grew up in a family, a very unusual family, where reading and ideas and teaching were simply as natural as drinking water. I'm a third generation professor in higher ed. My mother was not a professor, but she was a dean at Smith College, where my father was chair of the government department. And, conversation around the dinner table was always about books and ideas and art. So I think of my father as one of the last of the great New York intellectuals. That's where he came from. My mother's father had been on the geology faculty at Harvard. My mother was an amazing person. At the age of 15, she was offered a 4-year scholarship to MIT, a free ride, but turned it down because she wanted to go to Radcliffe, where she majored in chemistry, in the hard sciences in the 1950s. Yeah. She has perfect pitch. She was a child prodigy on the piano. This is a roundabout way of answering your question.
Sure.
Books were just everywhere. I mean, we read everything. I have no memory of not being surrounded by this kind of material at all times.
But was anybody sitting you down and saying, "Okay, David, it's reading time"?
No, it wasn't necessary. That's simply what that was not necessary in any way because that's what we did. That's what life was. Not to say it wasn't also music and athletics and other things, but it was a family the home was filled with thousands and thousands of books, and we read and we talked about what we were reading.
So at what point then did you go from being a natural-born reader in a family of readers to understanding that literature was something that was extra special for you, that you were going to choose it above other things?
That is such a hard question to answer, because I don't know exactly when. I know that when I was shown the alphabet, I immediately realized what you could do with it, and I was 5 years old, and I remember I wrote a story, and I still have it somewhere at home.
I'd love to read
It's
that.
3 sentences. I was 5 years old, and it was called Pete, and it goes, one day Pete went for a walk. Pete found a lost dog. Pete took the dog home. In big letters, they're about 3 inches high, all scrawled.
It's got a beginning, a middle,
It's
and
got
an
a beginning, a middle, and an end, and it's a comedy, really, in
Yeah.
the broadest sense. It's a journey of the hero, who encounters adversity and triumphs in the end. I do know that. Well, okay, I'm dancing around your question. At about the age of 12 or 13, I read James Joyce's Dubliners and A Portrait of the Artist as a Young Man. And I think that's about the time I also read some of Keats's Odes. And they just had this stupendous impact on me, especially the Joyce. And that was one moment. And
not something that a lot of 13-year-olds are reading.
I had an amazing high school English teacher.
Yeah.
Her name was Roseanne Soffer, and when she announced that she was teaching us honors English, she told us that she spelled her name, that when we were filling out the blanks, we should spell her name Suffer with an O, which is, this book, Part of the Darkness, one of my volumes of poetry, is dedicated to her. You would not believe what she had us read. We read 100 pages a night, every night for 2.5 years. I never took a course in the history and literature major. I never took an English course in the undergraduate major at Harvard where I had not already read half the material, at least half the material.
Well,
and that was because of Roseanne and because of my family. Then there was another moment I went through, which really was the definitive moment, when I was 18 and a freshman. And there was some kind of spiritual crisis, which is, too complex to discuss here, I suppose. But I emerged from that having made the decision to write poetry, to commit myself as a path of both profession and calling, profession and vocation,
Well,
to
that
poetry.
sounds.
And that was when I was 18.
That sounds a little like Joseph Campbell there,
Well,
where you enter the cave, you face the trial, and you come out changed.
Just like Pete
Yeah, Pete.
and his dog.
So you found poetry in the cave, and then off
Yes.
you went.
That's right. That's
Yeah.
true. And I was also and then there are a lot of books I was reading that fed into that, and some very, very, very great teachers. I don't think my parents ever quite forgave Roseanne Soffer because I had talents in other areas, and they didn't want me to go into literature. My own grandmother wouldn't speak to me for about 2 years.
Why not?
Because
There's no money in it?
there's and it's true. There's no money, and there's plenty of suffering and lots of craziness.
And you hang out with writers.
And I hang
life.
out with writers, and they're narcissistic and silly, but it's what I wanted to do and what I still want to do. I mean, and at the same time, after Roseanne, when I was at Harvard, in obviously a great history of poetry and the study of literature, it may have been one of the great times, because my teachers at Harvard included Czeslaw Miłosz, who won the Nobel Prize while he was giving the Norton Lectures, Mark Strand, who became U.S. Poet Laureate and won the Pulitzer Prize, of course, Derek Walcott, who won the Nobel, and Seamus Heaney, who won the Nobel, and Robert Fitzgerald, who was by far the greatest teacher of them all, the great translator of the Odyssey and the Iliad and the Aeneid, who won the Bollingen. So, a U.S. Poet Laureate, Pulitzer Prize winners, 3 Nobel Prize winners, a Bollingen Prize winner, and they were from all over the world, multiple languages. It was just utterly spectacular and wonderful. And then when I was a kid growing up at Smith, the poets who were around were exemplary. I mean, it was Anthony Hecht and W.H. Auden and Ted Hughes and Sylvia Plath and Richard Wilbur.
Well, that begins to answer
So-
one of my questions, which was why poetry? Even within literature, there are a lot of different
Why
ways to
poetry?
go. It seems like
Oh,
maybe
gosh.
you were immersed in it in a way that most people aren't. But really, answer that question. Why not follow in Tolkien's footsteps, or Asimov's, or anyone
Well,
else that was?
It's important to remember that Tolkien's primary bread and butter, he earned his keep by teaching poetry, and poetry is very important to him. He was a very, very, very great scholar of Northern European languages. And his essay on Beowulf, The Monster and the Critics, published in the 1930s before he wrote his books, is probably the single greatest thing ever written about Beowulf. And so his inspiration comes directly out of poetry, although he chose primarily to write fiction. But of course, there's a tremendous amount of verse and poetry in his published work, and an enormous amount of poetry that wasn't published, including a full translation of Beowulf and of Sir Gawain and the Green Knight, and of Pearl and Sir Orfeo and all this, and his own version of the death of King Arthur, and so on and so forth.
So would you say that in general there's less distinction between poetry and prose
Absolutely.
than we tend to think of?
Absolutely. And verse always comes first, as I teach my students. The word verse comes from the word versus in Latin, which means a turn. In other words, reverse, turn back, inverse, turn inward. Prose, do you know the etymology of prose?
I don't. Tell us.
Prose is a contraction of the prefix pro, which means forward. And guess what? Verse. Versus. So prose is just a verse that turns forward or doesn't turn. The word versus originally meant the turn that a plowman makes at the end of the furrow, which looks exactly like, a poem, writing in lines. Prose writers are just demented, psychotic plowmen who refuse to turn. They just, I'm just going to plow my neighbor's field, and then I'm going to plow through this parking lot, and then I'm going to plow through this body of water. And
if
so it's all verse.
Yeah.
All writing is verse. It's just that poets have, and verse, as we understand it, meaning writing in lines, comes first. So it's easier to answer why poetry for me than why poetry in general, but I'll try to answer both, and
Sure.
it'll only take a few hours.
yeah, okay, we'll let the
So for
the tape
me,
run.
I was, as you can tell, I was just completely entranced by language as a system, language as a human artifact. It's the most complex thing that human beings probably do in some ways. I mean, people don't even understand how it works still, and perhaps we never will. It's an astonishing faculty that human beings have developed that on which all other human activity, most other civilized human activity, explicitly depends. And it has so many different functions: reading and writing, listening and speaking. And writing and speaking are by no means coming from entirely the same parts of the brain or the mind, if we want to make the distinction. They are really strange and different from each other, actually. It's a very strange relationship.
And so what impulse was it then early on?
Well, in my case, it's the incredible complexity, the historical richness, and the beauty of highly wrought language, and its tremendous significance for human life, for thinking, for feeling, for expression, for insight, for growth, and unfortunately also for destruction and damage and violence and hatred.
And as Robin Williams pointed out in A Dead Poets Society, for wooing women.
Well, absolutely. Or for that matter, men.
Correct.
For wooing in any direction one wishes to go. Some of the most beautiful poems ever written between a man and a woman might arguably be Elizabeth Barrett Browning's Sonnets from the Portuguese. How do I love thee? Let me count the ways. So it goes both ways.
Right.
And it's in every way, between women and women, Sappho, between
Sure.
men and men, Walt Whitman. I mean, between oneself and one's soul,
Between oneself and the
between
earth.
oneself and the earth, between oneself and God. So simply to express any kind of intimacy in that way requires that kind of language. But of course, also it's obverse, unfortunately. So for me, it was this, and I seemed to be very drawn to understanding these structural properties and historical properties and aesthetic properties of linguistic artifacts. And I wanted to make them, and I wanted to be around them, and I wanted to be in communication with them as much as possible, as deeply as possible. And that's a big commitment, actually, because it's a big project. But then more broadly, we've sort of touched on that. Why poetry? Why does it matter? Poetry is absolutely at the core of our social order. It is at the core of our language. It is at the core of our politics. And people don't realize this, but it's easy enough to prove.
Okay, well, easy enough, but there again, we don't have 5 hours.
No, this is only I can do it in 1 minute.
And because I'm fascinated, because we live in a Twitter age, in the Instagram age. So how can you justify the statement that poetry is central to our politics and to our...
Every single person in the United States is a literary critic. Oh, say can you see by the dawn's early light what so proudly we hailed at the twilight's last gleaming? Here's the question, stand or kneel? Every single person in America has a view on that. And the views are interesting and complex and not easily resolved. That was not originally written as a song. It was originally written as a poem. It was, in fact, set to a 19th century drinking song called To Anacreon in Heaven, because the words happen to fit the melody. It was originally written as a poem. It is, in fact, a very troubled issue. It's our national anthem. It was on the front page of the paper for months. It still does matter. And if criticism comes from the word crisis, which means to choose, when we read that poem and we look at that debate, almost every single person in America probably has some kind of an opinion on it. That's a poem. There's example one. Example two is very simple. The entire Bible is basically a poem, among other things. It's written as verse. Most people have something to say about it, have read it, or at least have heard of it, and we quote it all the time.
Right.
And I think if we can start with the national anthem and the Bible, there are plenty of other examples. But if one were to remove those two things from our consciousness, we wouldn't be who we are. They're absolutely core.
Right. And so that poetry is central to how we make meaning.
Absolutely.
Is what I'm hearing you say.
And that's just the beginning. That's just the beginning. I mean, when people tell me they don't like poetry, I say, let's take a look at your iPod. How many songs are there on there? Let's take out everything that has any words in it. Done. Let's also remove all the words that you use that were coined by poets. Shakespeare coined about 1,700.
Sure.
And then I ask people, what does their name mean? It doesn't have to be a poem to have a poetic function. Every metaphor has a poetic function. Every figure of speech, everyone's name is a piece of poetry.
Well, you've already argued
the days of the week, the names of the planets, the months. Take away all of that. The shoe is on the other foot. The question is often asked, what does poetry add to life? I would take a scorched earth policy in return and say, good luck living without it. Because when you can come to me without using any of the words that were ever coined by poets, and I'm glad to go through and show them to you, if you can come to me without your name, if you can come to me without the national anthem and the Bible and every song you ever heard, and then make that argument, well, then we'll talk. You'll be standing wearing a potato sack and living in a cave.
Sure.
And you won't have any words to use, and I will win.
Well, there you have it. It's all about winning.
Poetry will win.
Think Radio is supported by the Gunnison Country Times, Gunnison, Colorado's locally owned hometown newspaper. Think Radio is also supported by listeners like you. To find out how you can join the Think Radio community of patrons, visit alanwartismedia.com. That's ALANWARTES media.com.
You've argued, powerfully already that everything is verse, prose is verse.
That's right.
And that this is intrinsic to how humans think, communicate certainly, but also make meaning. And that adds up. When we start talking about meaning, we get to a different word that is interesting to me because I'm a writer and I study these things alongside you. And that word is story. How words and verse and prose all add up to story. And so the question that I have for you in this day and age, when story is kind of a one-size-fits-all word. I mean, for instance, Instagram
Mm-hmm.
online. It's meant to be short little bites, but you can post a story on Instagram, and it consists of a single image, maybe a single phrase. And so people are understanding story in that context. So I want to ask you, given the breadth of your education and your experience with words, what is story?
Oh my gosh. That's a very tough question. You ask tough questions.
I love asking tough questions of people.
Here's a great story. I think it's by Ernest Hemingway. 6 words. You probably know this. For sale. Baby shoes. Never used. So why does that work? Because human beings evolved in such a way that stories are absolutely essential to their survival.
Explain that. Why, before we move on
will.
from there.
I will. We can't fly. We can't run very fast. Swimming is not natural for us. We don't have lots of fur to protect us. We don't have scales. We don't have claws. We don't have fangs. Well, I know a few people who do, but we won't talk about it. So we are born premature. You ever watch a calf get born? It comes out and it stands up. We're born premature, and there's a reason for that. It's because our heads are too big. We have to be born early enough to get through the birth canal because of our overdeveloped brains. At any rate, that's what I've read. So how did we survive? Well, we somehow evolved in such a way that we began to select ourselves for intelligence. It's like, I don't want to have a child with that one. That one's stupid. I want a smart one. But what happened was that I expect, to be a little bit reductive about it. People were sitting around the cave and somebody went out, to get an apple and got eaten, and they'd hear all these sounds of gnashing of teeth and the tearing of flesh. And then the next night somebody would say, I'm going to go get an apple, and someone would say, Og, bad idea. Remember what happened to Fred last night? We found him this morning, and that's a story. So what happened is that we learned how to recognize patterns better than other animals, as far as I can tell, better than most other animals. Maybe dolphins and whales and monkeys and dogs are pretty good at it too. But after all, we trained the dogs. We learned how to recognize patterns and to organize them in order to tell ourselves stories. And that's how we survived.
This
we
happened,
literally
and then
survived.
That happened,
that's right. And so therefore, let's try to do something else. And, we're sort of stupid about it. We it takes lots of repetition, but we're still better at it than lots of other animals, who don't, as far as we know, seem to operate in exactly the same way. What we do is we have the ability to take these patterns and this recognition of causality and to try to think about it, to make sense out of it in a symbolic way.
And to pass that on.
And to pass it on, and to articulate it. We developed ways to talk about it. And preeminent among those ways is the telling of stories. So it makes sense that we would get tremendous pleasure and delight and meaning, because I would also say it's pleasurable, and that's just as important as the meaningfulness, out of making such stories that are not necessarily even true or factual, because it triggers this place in our brain that is, I believe, closely aligned with our desire to survive. That's how we lived. That's what keeps us alive. Literally, our ability to do this is at the core of what we are as a species. If we can't do that, we have words for that. The word idiot is related to the word idiom, meaning a manner of communicating. And an idiot is someone who cannot be understood or cannot understand others, who is not part of that community of people who can tell stories. Literally. We use it colloquially, but originally it means literally someone who is, like somebody who can't communicate in any way because that person doesn't have any kind of language.
Well, I'm interested in the idea that meaning, the transmission of meaning, is just an intrinsic part of story.
That's it.
Could it also be true that an idiot is someone who has lost the ability to see the meaning in,
or who never
story?
had it? Somebody who has deficits, cognitive deficits that are so intense that person can never enter the community of linguistic communication, either in writing or in speech. The great cultural anthropologist Clifford Geertz describes this in a single sentence as well as I've ever heard it done. And he says at one point, a culture is the ensemble of stories that we tell ourselves about ourselves. A culture is the ensemble of stories that we tell ourselves about ourselves.
And is it possible to not do that? Is it
For a
possible
culture?
to be a culture that has lost its ability to tell coherent stories about itself?
Well, I think that the stories aren't always happy, and they don't always agree with each other. In fact, they often disagree with each other and contradict each other.
Mm-hmm.
But I've never, well, I don't think so. I've never, there is no such society. There are many societies that break down, and you wind up literally having wars because people are telling themselves different stories that they cannot reconcile. One of the great things about the United States has been the notion of tolerance and the creation of a public social and political space where we agree to tolerate highly contradictory stories, all as part of what has been called our civic religion. So, for example, we have made it an article of faith that we do not dispute each other's faith because we know that has led to so much trouble in the past in other societies. So the story that we tell ourselves, and this is an amazing story, and it's not perfect, and God knows there are, if he existed, he would know. At any rate, maybe he knows. Let's say maybe God knows that we have our problems when it comes to this, but so far we do better still than many other places in the world. So far, we allow ourselves to tell ourselves as a community or as a culture many stories with which many of us disagree.
Mm-hmm. Well, the fiercely independent American who doesn't need anybody or anything but their own ingenuity, that's an American story.
One, yeah.
Yeah. I mean, there are lots of them.
That's true.
But here's the point, is that sometimes today when you say story, people think you're talking about just what happens at the cinema or just what happens when they buy a book. But you're suggesting that story is part of the fabric, that you can't have a society without stories.
You can't even have a human consciousness. You can't, say what you're going to do today without telling a story, or what you did yesterday. The ability symbolically, by which I mean using language or communication systems, you could use pictures, you could use video, you could use film. Simply the ability to organize experience symbolically in a sequential way that makes sense is an important part of what it means to be a human being.
So in the life of a community then, we've been talking at the nation state level, let's bring it down to just a community which I would define as the civic unit of such a size that you have a reasonable chance of running into your neighbors in the grocery store. How can a community wrap its arms around the idea that it is telling itself stories and to take more responsibility for what those stories are?
It depends on the community, I guess. I think there are many communities that do that. In the community of the graduate program of creative writing at Western, believe me, everybody's taking responsibility for it. Otherwise, they don't graduate.
Right.
If you're talking about a larger political order.
Yeah. Gunnison County, let's take that as an example.
I think Gunnison County does pretty well. We just had an election cycle. It sure didn't look like the national election cycle. People were civil, thoughtful, respectful. They disagree. There were good public fora. How can a community do that? Well, I would suggest that there are a lot of pieces to that. And I've said this in a number of other interviews, and I think you've heard some of them, and I say it everywhere I can. The most important thing is probably reading. In a modern, free, open, democratic society, which is what we aspire to be, you can't have people who are participating in the central public institutions of that society, elections, the courts, organizational boards, various other kinds of social institutions, unless they're literate. High rates of literacy, and by that I mean deep literacy, sophisticated literacy, where you're capable of thinking critically about the issues of the day whatever they may be in your community. If people don't have that ability to read critically and discuss things critically, and they don't understand the history of our institutions, of our Constitution, for example, it seems to me unlikely that you're going to have very good conversations.
Well,
and the conversations are key. In order to have meaningful, healthy, open, free, democratic public institutions where individuals are respected, you have to be able to have thoughtful, critical, well-informed conversations about those issues. And that's why education and reading in particular are so tremendously important, because without that background, without giving people enough ability to think for themselves as citizens and as members of social institutions and of communities, it seems to me highly unlikely that you're going to be able to thrive and prosper, and for that matter, even remain free.
Well, how would you rate then the state of our capacity as a nation to do what you've just described?
Oh,
I mean, you used you used the word literacy, right? And that means more than just being able to recognize letters.
No, I call it deep
patterns.
literacy, meaning critical thinking, informed historical understanding.
Where do we stand? What is your take on where we stand?
Well, it's hard to be enthusiastic and positive. On the other hand, I probably am somewhat more enthusiastic and positive than some people.
Why would you say that?
Well, I think we're doing a lot better than a lot of other places, frankly, still. I still think the United States is an extraordinary country. It has many problems. We're not living in, say, Syria, a country literally destroyed by civil war with 500,000 dead, at least.
Literacy means something very different there, I would imagine.
Certainly. You have their competing narratives about what the country should be, and people are willing to kill and to die for them violently, and to commit all sorts of heinous acts in order to win. It's such a big question, Alan. I think our institutions remain strong in many ways, although I think we face many challenges.
In what way does story stand at the center of that statement that you just made?
Okay. I do think we're in the midst of a tremendous social experiment involving human communication with no control group. And that experiment involves social media and electronic communication. Many people had high hopes for this technology when it emerged, and we all use it every day. And I believe that in the right context, it can be very, very useful and powerful. However, it has all sorts of impacts that I think were unforeseen and that are clearly deleterious. The greatest challenge to telling the kinds of stories that matter to the health of the society, as you mentioned, I believe I'm going to introduce a term, long-form concentration. That's should be one of the primary goals of all education, all formative education, all the way up through the senior year of college, which generally, if you're an honors student, ends with a thesis of some kind or a research project. Long-form concentration. One of the most important goals of all formative education is to inculcate long-form concentration.
The ability to follow an argument
at length.
Through complexity.
At length, meaning for an hour or two, at least. This is clearly essential to success in all sorts of things that matter to us. First of all, in the professions, to be a lawyer, to be a military commander, to be the coach of a basketball team, to be a teacher, to be a surgeon. How would you feel if your surgeon was, tweeting your heart transplant, getting distracted? This notion of multitasking that was so popular for a while has now been disproven again and again and again as being deleterious to the ability of human beings to complete tasks, including driving to the grocery store. You can't text and drive. No more can you text and learn French or learn about, Chinese history or algebra. This endless culture of interruption that we have destroys the ability to converse, destroys the ability to listen, not destroys, damages, compromises the ability to converse, compromises the ability to listen, compromises the ability to make and understand complex arguments. And we live in a world where we need to be able to do this. If we're going to really think about American foreign policy, the justice system, the relations between men and women, relations among the races, our economic climate, our new tax code, what it means to be a spiritual person.
None of that fits
anything
in a
like
tweet.
this. How to have how to have a happy marriage, how to learn to be a surgeon. You go on and on.
Right.
How to make an argument before the Supreme Court. How to fix an engine. I mean, you name it. The ability to plan, the ability to think clearly and critically, the ability to listen to other people at length and to engage in thoughtful and serious conversation. This is the outcome of this question of literacy. There's a great, brilliant English political and social theorist and social philosopher or moral philosopher named Michael Oakeshott, who died about 30 or 40 years ago. And he wrote a lot about education. And he argues that education properly understood, and here I'm almost quoting him verbatim, from an essay called The Voice of Poetry in the Conversation of Mankind. He says, it's not about facts or knowledge or even skills or techniques. What it's really about is learning how to participate in the different kinds of conversations that are at the core of every human society. So, in fact, here we are sitting in a radio station, having a podcast, which is embedded in a university, at an educational institution. And a lot of these institutions, there's still a lot of good happening. I am very worried about the culture of distraction, the culture of interruption, the culture of the shortened attention span, because frankly, what we have to do is fight it. We have to, if we're going to educate people to be self-aware, to be good citizens, to be full participants in an open, free, and democratic society, and to succeed in their professions, to think meaningfully and behave meaningfully in a complex society, we have to enable them to enter into these ancient conversations. That's where the literacy comes in.
Do you see a path back from short-form society?
We're doing it right now. That's all you can do. All you can do is continue to participate in civil society, in spiritual life, in politics, in your family, in your community, in your church, in your whatever it may be, and to realize that those values are the core values. Without these values, none of the other values are going to matter, whatever they may be, free markets or socialism, whether or not God exists, how to have a curriculum that works. First have to be able to have enough people who are ready, willing, and able to engage in these kinds of conversations. So it really comes back to a very self-conscious approach to education at all levels where we try to inculcate that. So
in your role as a trainer of writers,
of dancing bears, of writers, yes.
That's a world-changing profession, as you just laid it out.
Well,
training people to think at that level of complexity and to converse and to communicate clearly.
It should be. It should be approached that way. Otherwise, why do it? We could have all been lawyers, or which is a perfectly, good thing to do. I hesitate to call it an honorable profession, but there are plenty of other things that writers could probably do with their gifts. But to be a writer is to aspire to tell those stories and be part of those conversations and spark them and participate in them. And it's not something that is an add-on. It's not something that happens over there after all the rest of the work is done. If the writing is any good, if imaginative writing is any good, if the literary imagine means anything, it's not just dessert. It's the whole meal. I mean, it's there at all times. At all times. Our very notion of what it means to be who we are. Who are you, Alan? Who are you, Kat? Who am I, David? In order to have any sense of that, you have to tell some kind of a story. You have to use language. You have to use metaphors and figures of speech. This is not an add-on. This is This is absolutely essential to our lives.
Well, that is a marvelous segue to what I want to do next, and that is hear a poem.
How about a poem by somebody other than me to begin with? This is Think Journal, which is published by our program. It was started by a woman named Christine Urich in 2008, and she basically conveyed it to us when this program got going. And it's, I believe, Western's only internationally distributed print journal. We are really proud of it. As you can see, it's very, as everyone listening to this can see, it's very beautiful.
I can say so myself.
So here's this woman named Rena Espaillat, who I don't think, if Rena Espaillat has an enemy anywhere on this earth, I'd be surprised. She must be about 80 now. She didn't really start writing poetry seriously till she was well on in life. She might have been as old as 60, in her 50s at any rate.
Which is not as well on as it used to be.
It's pretty late to become a serious writer, but and she's bilingual in Spanish, and I think she was God, I'll read you her bio. She's amazing. She's published 9 full-length books and 3 chapbooks comprising poetry, essays, and short stories in both English and her native Spanish, and translations of the work of Richard Wilbur and Robert Frost into Spanish. Her original work in translation from and into Spanish, many journals, 70 anthologies, dozens of websites, and so on. Many awards. And here's a poem called This House. And you'll see what poetry can do, perhaps. She's the featured poet in the current issue, which is the Spring 2017 issue, volume 7.2. Rena Espaillat. This House. This house is a fallow field at season's close, where clay and stones are rife, but nothing grows. A graveyard of work begun and tools untended, since all your joyful labor abruptly ended. What breath can reawaken? What pulse restart the beat that once was steady in its lost heart? This house is an old instrument no longer played, but loud with silent echoes. Music we made. So the amazing thing about this poem to me is that I know the story behind it, but you don't really have to know it. It's clearly someone pining for a dead spouse, or lover, or someone with whom she made a life, who has died. And in fact, her husband of 50 or 60 years, and they seems to have had an incredible marriage, had passed away recently when she wrote it. So I think that aside from the fact that it takes a lot of emotional courage to write a poem like that, the quality of what she's done here in just a couple of, my God, it might be, it's probably less than 200 syllables. And you get a whole life, a true story of mourning. M-O-U-R-N-I-N-G. This is a poem of mourning in which never flinches or turns away from the mourning, that also is filled with love. I don't know how else one could so powerfully convey that very, very human story. I loved this person. I made a life with this person in this place, and the place is now empty and seems to be almost dead because you who I loved are gone. The word you doesn't appear until about the 7th line. Tools untended, since all your joyful labor abruptly ended. So what happens is these very small words, just the word you, when you realize that it is addressed You don't realize that at the beginning. This house is a fallow field at season's close, where clay and stones are rife, but nothing grows, a graveyard of work begun and tools untended, since all your joyful labor abruptly ended. And that word you there becomes so powerful and resonant.
Well,
and it's literally, the whole thing is 3 sentences. That's the first sentence. Then what breath can reawaken, what pulse restart the beat that once was steady in its lost heart? Now she's thinking about it objectively. This house is an old instrument, no longer played, but loud with silent echoes, music we made. So she uses the word you only once. And then it becomes we. And this is good stuff. This woman is the bomb. I mean, this is just fantastic writing.
Well, and it expresses the power of all storytelling, but especially in poetry, to speak for others. Because how many people would not have the capacity to write like that?
Not many.
But have felt precisely those emotions.
And that's why those stories matter so much, because by bringing them up like fish from the depths, bathypelagic fish, they become comprehensible and nameable and real. And, you know, the notion that that would only be an add-on to our consciousness is absurd. This is why human beings come together to grieve and to mourn and use such powerful words. You know, it's like there are no atheists in foxholes. Lots of people say they don't like poetry until it's time for a wedding or a funeral, you know, or an inauguration or a commencement. At the most important moments of their lives, turning points of their lives, they turn to it. And, you know, Rena, I mean, she really brings the goods. So we're very proud to publish her. So there's a poem by somebody else.
Yeah.
I always think it's important to do that. There is a culture of narcissism in the poetry world that drives me crazy, in the creative writing world in general. And I am not interested in merely talking about my poems. Of course I care about them, but I want to be in a conversation with other poets, the living and the dead, whom I think about and admire, or don't admire for that matter, and want to contend with.
Well, thanks for sharing that one.
Thank you.
You are also, as a parting note, the director of the Gunnison Arts Center Headwaters Poetry Festival.
Yes.
Along with Tony Todd.
Right.
What's coming up?
We have a wonderful, Tony and I, who she's a delight to work with. She is now, speaking of and on radio, you know, she's the manager of KBUT, and she has taught here at Western, and she runs a coffee farm in Hawaii and plays the ukulele, and she's an amazing person.
Truly.
And such a pleasure to work with. And we run this little thing called the Headwaters Poetry Festival and Reading Series, which is not just about poetry broadly defined as making, you know. So we have journalists, and you've been part of it. We have fiction writers, essayists. We bring it all. And the goal is to bring together the people in this valley and nearby in the region who care deeply about words. And we have a festival every year. The next one's in October. And then we do 3 or 4 readings through the course of the year, usually featuring a visitor and several locals. The next one is February 23rd, which is Friday. And the featured visiting reader is a woman named Rhonda Claridge, who lives in Telluride and teaches English at CMU in Montrose. And she's an absolutely wonderful short story writer. Among other things, she writes other things as well, and she's coming over to read. And then we'll have several locals, and I believe it's going to be the editors and publishers I'm hoping they're all going to come, from our local newspapers, from the Gunnison.
That sounds good. From
the Gunnison paper and the Crested Butte paper, and I believe, I can't remember if I've heard back from Will or Chris. One of the two has told me he can come. And then I was talking with Mark Riemann today, and we'll talk about journalism.
All right.
And I hope everyone who's listening will come. We open the bar, we have a good time, and then we all go out to dinner, dance on the tables.
They're terrific fun. And it's an opportunity right here in this community to come and participate in a long-form conversation.
The quality of the writing in this region is extraordinarily high. I think that Colorado in general, and perhaps even in some ways, especially the western slope of Colorado, is in an extraordinary phase where there's a lot of development of extremely strong writing in many different genres. It's very interesting what's going on. There's very little cynicism. There's a lot of creativity, a lot of passion, a lot of intelligence, and a really strong community of writers who really enjoy each other's company. And that's what we try to help to make happen and be part of in this series.
Well, David, I thank you for your role in that. And I also thank you for being on Think Radio today.
And I thank you for what you're doing as a writer and as for hosting this.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Think Radio is supported by the Gunnison Country Times, Gunnison, Colorado's locally owned hometown newspaper.
Think Radio is a production of Alan Wardis Media. The show's associate producer is Kat Seibert. Music by Issa Forrest. You've been listening to Think Radio on KWSB FM 91.1 in Gunnison, Colorado, from the campus of Western State Colorado University. Thanks for joining us for another episode of Think Radio.